So today we're going to be kind of diving into the policy landscape. Some of you might have already attended this session with Department of Education employees. So some of what we might be talking about is definitely going to be similar and building off of that. But to get started, my name is Hannah Weissman. I'm the Director of Policy at code.org. And I'm also from Minnesota, so it's great to be here. And I've been working really closely in Minnesota on policy and implementation. So going to share a little bit about that with you today. I don't think we'll take up the whole time, so we'll definitely have time to ask questions. And please, for folks to stop me or jump in. This is certainly like for your time to get kind of a overview of the policy landscape. And my hope is that you'll all walk away with understanding what policies have passed and the impact of those policies, and then importantly, knowing how to get engaged um, should you want. And Carol, I'm sorry to hear that about your position being eliminated, but hopefully a CTE license or a future computer science license that we're going to have in Minnesota will be helpful for you. So
Thank you.
to dive in, one of the things that we really focus in on my position is policies, right? We, from our experience at code.org, which as many of you probably know, right, we're a national nonprofit, and we have curriculum, but you might not be as familiar with the policy side of what we do. And the reason that we have policies is so, Carol, to use your unfortunate example, right? So it's not just dependent on like one school or district, and that like the position is very uncertain. When there's more statewide support, when there are things like computer science licenses and all of that structure, we find that it ends up being more stable for teachers and districts and states. And so we have 10 different policies, and it really is about creating an ecosystem in which computer science can be a foundational part of school. So if we think about all the things that any other subject has, math or science, they have standards, they have teacher certification, they have support from the Department of Education. All of those are things that, 5 years ago, computer science didn't have in any state. And increasingly, we're seeing more states now start to put in these structures for computer science. And that really allows there to be clarity across the whole state about what computer science is, allows there to be capacity to teach, allows there to be statewide leadership, and then sustainability as well. I would love if you guys want to just put in the chat. I'd be curious if this is familiar to folks, this policy landscape, or if this is a new thing. You can just put a yes, it's familiar, or no, this is new to me. Awesome, wonderful. Thanks, Carol. I know that folks can chime in as we go along. So I just want to take the time then now to kind of go through these policies and talk about where we're at in Minnesota. And then please at any point you can unmute and ask questions or put it in the chat. So in 2023, as some of you might be aware, we had the Computer Science Advancement Act passed in Minnesota, and that was actually the first piece of legislation ever dedicated to computer science. So it did a bunch of different things. So I'm going to walk through that with you all. First of all, first ever legislation. It added a full-time CS specialist to the Minnesota Department of Education, so that's Andrea Vasquez-Wilson. It created a working group, which is headed by MDE. It gave MDE the authority to implement a grant program for professional development. That has not yet happened, but they now have that authority. It instructed teacher preparation programs to work towards preparing in-service teachers for computer science. So the idea is, for example, like elementary school teachers, they get exposure to literacy, they get exposure to math. The idea is eventually they'd also get exposure to computer science as well. It required data collection K-12. So in Minnesota right now, there isn't data collection from the state happening on a K-8 level, and only some high schools are reporting. And so from our perspective at code.org, it makes that data collection process a lot harder. So all the high schools that don't report to the state in Minnesota, we directly contact those high schools. So we still have a good sense of who's teaching computer science and who's not in Minnesota, but that's not a particularly scalable model. So we're really working with the state to push them to collect offerings K through 12. And then it allocated $1 million to fund all these activities, which is a good start. But if anyone who's familiar with budgets might know that that's a lot of things to do with $1 million. And so we're going to talk about why we're continuing to work with the legislature to get more funds. Does anyone have any questions or comments so far about the legislation that was passed last year? On we go. So I'm going to kind of tie in what policies Minnesota has passed with that nationwide policy landscape. And importantly, if we go back to that landscape, this is our national guidelines. We know that it's going to look a bit different in every state. So we're going to talk about, where Minnesota sits within these policies and how that needs to be adjusted based on state needs. So if we look at our first two policies, we now have a statewide plan. So for those of you who don't know, the working group created a statewide plan just this March, and it's now live on their website. So I will actually can post that in the chat at the end of this for anyone who's not read it. It's really comprehensive. I think it's almost 60 pages, which is really wonderful. And so we now have that, and that's really crucial for guiding our work. It lays out, immediate goals, and it lays out further goals as well. So it really guides what we should be doing as a state. Importantly, it's not law. The legislature has to then choose to adopt whatever they may want within it. So that is an important point. Just having a state plan does not mean that it is all enacted, but it's that guideline of where are we going as a state and where are our goals. One of the things that we don't have in Minnesota that the plan talks about is standards. And for those of you who've been in the classroom, you know that not having standards can be a challenge. There's obviously resources out there, such as Computer Science Teachers Association standards and other standards, but we don't have statewide standalone standards. We have embedded, but not separate. And that's really puts us in the minority of states. The vast majority of states do have standalone computer science standards. All right. For our next policies, we now do have funding allocated, as I mentioned in that Computer Science Advancement Act last year. And currently the money has been spent on the working group and then funding Andrea's position at MDE. And then certification, and we were mentioning that a little bit briefly when we were in the chat with Carol. This is something that Minnesota does not have. So Minnesota has CTE, business teachers, math teachers, and library media specialists are authorized to teach computer science, but there is not a computer science license or endorsement or certification. And that also puts Minnesota at the minority of states. And one of the things that's really important with this license is it allows often teachers to recognize the competencies and the skills that they've gained in the classroom. Specific professional development can be targeted towards them. Of course, we don't want a license to be overly restrictive. So, and actually the state plan, they lay out guidance where they would still allow like library media teachers and CTE teachers to teach computer science. But they also want to move away from all the onus falling on just math teachers. Any questions so far? All right. Okay. Well, our next policy is creating university programs to encourage all pre-service teachers to gain exposure. And the legislature has indicated that this is a priority. It was in the bill last year, calling out that that's where they want to go. There has not yet been any funding allocated for that. So I would say it's in the works. This is actually an area where I think Minnesota could be a leader in. Only 5 states have programs where all of their pre-service teachers have to get some exposure. There's a lot of states where it's maybe an elective in a pre-service teacher program, but we really want to work towards all teachers getting that exposure. And then we do in Minnesota have a dedicated computer science position at the state. And for anyone on this call who's interacted with Andrea or with Sarah at the department, it makes a huge difference because their job is to support computer science. Their job is to expand it across the state. And without a person in the state, we find that just far less gets done. And so we now have Andrea, who's full-time, as well as Sarah Carter, who's a STEM specialist, and a third of her time is on CS. So we have 1 1/3 people in Minnesota, which is really wonderful. Yeah, Jean, question.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I know you moved on to number 6, but I'm curious
Yeah,
about the pre-service programs for
yeah,
teachers. So
absolutely.
you mentioned that there isn't, this is something that Minnesota could be a lead in, but there isn't not a lot of funding for it. So I'm like curious about like how were these programs established in other states, like these 5 states that have them, and yeah, and I'm just curious like for the 5 states, and then like who in the university is teaching these like CS courses.
Yeah, great question. So in the 5 states that have required computer science for pre-service teachers, it can go in a few different ways. Sometimes it's specific legislation that mandates it. Other times it is to get approved as a pre-service program, you have to meet all these competencies, and computer science is one of them. So there's a few different ways. That it goes. But then in terms of who's teaching it, it is a range. I think it depends on how sort of robust that exposure is. And importantly, we aren't setting guidelines of what that should look like. So there's certainly exposure that is more technical, and they do have some CS faculty involved with that. But then there's definitely exposure that's more almost like the PD that teachers receive in service teachers, where it's, a module within a course. And that it might be an education faculty teaching it, or it might even be someone that they've brought in outside the university, someone who runs more traditional PD. So there is a range. And then in terms of funding, sometimes that is funding from the state level, sometimes that is the university. In Minnesota, we now have I don't know if folks are familiar with Jen Rosato, but she works out of the University of Minnesota now, and an organization called the North Star Collaborative, which is all about computer science. So we already have had the university system in Minnesota buy in to the need to have computer science education. And there already is good collaboration between the Department of Education and the computer science department, both in Duluth and the Twin Cities. And so again, I think it really depends. Some of it's the bandwidth too, right? There's sometimes universities where they don't have any extra faculty in computer science. So that's where they might be helping their education colleagues give some folks some competencies. Great question. And I would say too, this is an area where, I think we're still as a community figuring this out of what it looks like to give every pre-service teacher some exposure to computer science. But for the most part, right, it's not a full computer science class per se. I think that's obviously the gold standard, right? Getting teachers an intro computer science class so they can really get their hands on, but that's often not where universities are at in terms of scalability at the moment. Alrighty, our next one is requiring all schools to offer computer science with appropriate timelines. So 31 other states have all of their high schools required to offer CS, and then 17 of these states also require elementary and middle schools. So we aren't there in Minnesota yet, but that's one of the core goals of the statewide plan is to get us to that point. And currently in Minnesota, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we're at 28% of our high schools. So we have a long way to go in Minnesota to get there. But this policy is really important for helping those schools that might not themselves do it because they don't have staffing or it's not a priority. So when that state says this is a priority, we need this in every school, then we of course see more schools adding computer science. Importantly, this policy doesn't have a lot of teeth if it doesn't come with funding, right? Because the schools that aren't offering computer science, there's a reason. There's some barrier. And so if there's not funding provided, it's going to be a lot harder for them to fulfill that mandate. 8 is actually a policy that every state plus DC has, which is allowing computer science to count towards a pre-existing graduation requirement. So often this means it counts as a math or a science or maybe an elective. So one of the first policies we worked on back in 2015 with Microsoft. And, we were early on in figuring out what policies were important for computer science. And we have since realized that it doesn't actually made a big impact. In Minnesota, for example, you have to show that the computer science class is meeting the math standards. And most computer science classes don't meet all the math standards because it is a different subject. And that's the case in a lot of states where, in theory, a student can be counting it for a math or a science or elective, but they often aren't, or it's not making a big difference. So this is sort of where, you learn, and we're really glad every state has these policies. But we realize we need to go further. Sort of gets us to our next slide. And I'll jump to 10 first. because of our learning that it wasn't just enough to have computer science satisfy an existing graduation requirement, we have now in the last year created a 10th policy in which we are encouraging states to have some sort of graduation requirement. And in the 9 states, this looks different. It ranges everything from a quarter of a quarter class to a full year. Rhode Island, for example, does competency-based, so that can look like a course, but that could also look like a work-based experience or an internship. So there's a real range, and we certainly want states to have that flexibility to fit it within their existing school structure. But we have seen in these states that the participation rates, as it might make sense, right, are truly equal because every student has to take that. And we haven't seen any other state be able to reach all of its female students or all of its students who are on IEPs or English language learners. And then just quickly jumping back, one of the things that sort of ties along with the graduation requirement is we need to make sure that that aligns with the existing entrance requirements for state universities. And so it doesn't happen a lot, but if a state university required 4 years of science, 4 years of math, and they had all these requirements, and they weren't actually recognizing that all students were taking computer science and there wasn't a call out in that, it might make it hard for students to align. So we just want to make sure that there's alignment from that high school to higher ed. All right. Before I actually go into an example of graduation requirements, I just want to pause here if there's any other questions or comments about the policy landscape in Minnesota. Wonderful. Well, I'll keep going on to put questions as you have them in the chat. So I just want to give an example because I think, graduation requirement is big. It is absolutely, it's our biggest policy. And I think for a lot of folks, it can feel really daunting, especially if you are in a school and you're the only person who does anything computer science and you think, how could I possibly reach every kid before they graduate? So I want to give an example. North Dakota actually just passed a graduation requirement. Just want to give an example to you all and lay out the timeline of how this actually is feasible, though it certainly does take time and investment. So let's go through what North Dakota did here. So as you see, this is an 11-year timeline. So that's kind of the time that it takes. So in 2015, the Department of Public Instruction formed a working group. So if you want to translate that to Minnesota time, we did that in 2023. So we're about 8 years behind. In 2019, they passed standards. That would be the next step for us. We don't yet have standards. They established a teaching credential aligned to standards. They created a state plan. Now we obviously have that. And I think importantly in every state, there is not one roadmap of what you do. You could do things at different levels. So we already have a state plan. So that puts us, I think, in a really good place in Minnesota. In 2023, the graduation requirement passed through the legislature. And one of the things that the plan called out, which I would say is a best practice, is it required all school boards and districts to create a plan for how they would meet it. So they didn't want to just create a requirement and say, do it. They wanted districts and boards to think about how they could meet this requirement. They submit their plans to the state, and that allows them, if they are feeling concerned that they won't be able to meet the requirement or worried about staffing, for there to be a bit of a two-way conversation about how they can meet this requirement. And then in 2026, the graduation requirement will be in full effect in North Dakota. So you can see, right, they built their way up to it. So in Minnesota, right, we've got a working group, and we've got a state plan, but there are some other aspects that we need, particularly around teaching credentials and standards, to kind of lay that foundation for ensuring that a graduation requirement would be successful in Minnesota. One of the things that you might have noticed is, I didn't mention anything about funding in North Dakota. North Dakota is an interesting example where they actually haven't allocated state funds, but they have used a lot of federal funds, and they used a lot of the money given out during COVID. That is an unusual example, and I think they're able to do that on account of them being a smaller state, but we generally see that states need to allocate state money to be successful. But there's always ways to certainly be creative. And so North Dakota has been able to be creative with federal funds, and thus far has found success. But I think they'll be looking to try and allocate some state resources to this as well. And just in case anyone wasn't, fully convinced, we see that these policy levers are crucial for accelerating computer science, for focusing on equity and sustainability. And we do see that when states adopt more policies, the percent of their high schools teaching computer science is significantly higher. So there's certainly quite a strong correlation between number of policies passed and the percent of teaching. Any questions? Alrighty, on we go. So now we're going to dive a little bit into the data in Minnesota, and then we will wrap up. And if folks have any other questions, we can chat about that. So importantly, before we go into the data, I want to just give a disclaimer that we absolutely are focused on K through 12 computer science and policy and implementation. And we often do not have data at the elementary or middle school level in the same way that we do for high school. Because at high school, right, it's a standalone course, there's a course code, there's all those structures in place. And so for the next several slides, we're going to be talking just about high school. But that isn't to say that I don't want to be talking about elementary and middle school. I just don't have that data. So nationally, we have data that about 57% of public high schools in the United States offer computer science. To put some numbers to that, there are about 25,000 high schools in the United States. So a little over 12,000 are teaching computer science. It's actually maybe close to 14. In Minnesota, that number looks quite different. It's 28%. And I think, I know in the last few years, there's been a lot of sort of press attention around this number and really bringing folks into that our number is low in Minnesota. And it is. And I think if we think back to that timeline in North Dakota, we just really started investing in computer science in the last year or two. And so when you don't invest in something, it's left to the individual schools, and we see that more well-resourced districts are able to have computer science, but smaller districts or districts that have a lot of other priorities have not necessarily had the ability to have computer science in their schools yet. Something that I think also is important to acknowledge in Minnesota is we have more schools than a lot of states. Some of that's because we have a lot of charter schools in Minnesota. We also have a lot of small schools. And so in Minnesota, we have about 800 public high schools. That's a lot more than states of our same size. In Massachusetts, which is a similar size, they have closer to like 400 high schools. So that isn't to let us off the hook in Minnesota. We need to be working to get every student access to computer science. I think it's important just to acknowledge that we have a bigger task on our hand in Minnesota because we have so many schools. And this just puts us in context with our neighbors. So I really like this graphic because it talks about access to high school computer science, then also shows some of the policies. So you can see that our neighboring states, generally speaking, more policies translates into higher access, though not always. We can see in Wisconsin and even in South Dakota, they don't have a ton of policies either. And yet they've been able to have a lot of computer science. So again, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but the general trend is more policies, more offering. And I was just actually down in Iowa earlier this week. And one of the things I think Iowa has done really well that I think Minnesota is poised to learn from is Iowa has really focused on getting computer science into very small schools. So I was touring some schools with graduating classes of 40 students at the first school and graduating class of 28 students at the second school. Those are generally schools that have a lot of challenges in offering robust elective choices and offering a course of computer science. And yet there has been statewide effort and prioritization of getting computer science in these schools. So that's a reason that Iowa has such a high percentage is because they've really focused on those schools that in other states are very not likely to offer. So let's look a little bit at the data in Minnesota. So right in Minnesota, if you think about that 28% of high schools offer, it's really good to dive into that a little bit more and ask ourselves, okay, what are the kinds of schools that are offering, what are the kind of schools that are not offering? So if we start with geography, we see in Minnesota that there's work to be done across all geographic areas. But as we see in a lot of states, suburban schools are the most likely in Minnesota to offer. And then both rural and urban are less likely to offer. And that's what we see in every state. So that really parallels. I think for Minnesota, what's really crucial to call out is this second graph. So we define small schools as under 500 students. So this again, this is just at the high school level. So under 500 students. Large schools are over 1,200 students, and then medium are in between. So if we just look at those large schools, if we think about the schools in Minnesota that are over 1,200 students, so that's a lot of urban schools, a lot of suburban schools. I know I went to St. Paul Central. When I went, it was almost 2,400 students. Now it's a little bit smaller. But so those are big high schools. Almost all of those are teaching computer science. And when we think about that, that makes sense, right? Those big high schools often offer a lot more electives. They have more teachers, and it's often easier for them to offer those kinds of courses. But our small schools in Minnesota are really where a lot of our attention needs to focus. So those schools that are under 500 students, whether they be in urban areas, suburban areas, or rural areas, are struggling to offer. And that is definitely what we see in other states. Though I think notably, this is a larger gap in Minnesota than we see in other states. So if we think about how do we move up in Minnesota, how do we get that total of 28% a lot higher? It's really going to be focusing on these small schools. That's where a lot of the work remains in Minnesota. Pause here while we're looking at some pretty charts to see if any folks have questions about this data or anything that they're wondering. Yeah, Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to keep asking
No,
questions.
please. I love it.
I'm curious. So you mentioned Iowa a little bit, and Iowa seems to have, like I mean, as a neighboring state, seems to have a lot more. I just it seems like they have a lot more initiatives in terms of
Yes,
what they're doing with CSED. So I'm curious, what are some things we can learn from them? Just because it's been like
absolutely.
inspiring and also really impressive to see just like uh many like so like a cohort of CS teachers at CSTA. Like I think last year, no, 2 years ago, just seeing a bunch of them all at once.
Absolutely. So I think there's a bunch of things we can learn. I think one of the things that Iowa does, which is really strong, is they do professional development all around the state. So I think one of the things that we sometimes see with small schools and rural schools is if a teacher has to drive, if they're in northern Minnesota and they're having to drive 6 hours to the Twin Cities, if that's the only place that computer science is professional development's happening, that's a barrier. So Iowa has really worked to every summer they move their in-person professional development around the state to show teachers that no matter where you are, that's important. So that's really, I think that's one of the strongest things that they've done. And they also, I think with that, have just created this community in this sense of importance. They have a very strong nonprofit and private sector involvement in computer science. They have a lot of industries in Iowa, just as we do in Minnesota, where computer science is necessary and important. But I think the big difference between both Iowa and North Dakota is this has been an investment for many years. And so I think, we're going to talk about in the next few slides sort of how you all can get involved. And when the legislature and the governor every year talk about computer science and they go and they see schools and they visit, that really makes a big difference. So, I think for all of you in the classroom, one of the best things you can do is invite your legislators to come into your school. Whether you be a teacher or an administrator, whatever it might be, is bring them in and say, come and see the work that we're doing. A lot of folks in policy, they don't know what it looks like for computer science to be in schools, and they especially do not know what it looks like at that elementary level. So, when I was in Iowa just this past week, I was there for a policy conference, and part of that conference was going and seeing schools. That's a real strong thing that they've done in Iowa to say, we want you to come to our classrooms. We want you to see the work that we're doing. We don't want to all just be sitting in a room talking about kids and teachers. We want to be there and see their work. So there's some general examples, but I also say the folks in Iowa are very nice and willing to help. They actually come up to Minnesota and have partnered with some of the folks in Minnesota. So I think we have a lot of neighbors in Minnesota who are really willing to help. And but I think importantly, in any state, as in Minnesota, this can't just be an effort led by the Twin Cities. Duluth and Rochester and Greater Minnesota need to all feel included and a part of this and feel that this is something that makes sense in their communities. Whether you're in a rural community or urban community, you want to have your students prepared for that 21st century. All right, so as we're kind of wrapping up our presentation, I want to talk about what's next. So we do have legislation going through the process this year. It is very similar to last year's. It allocates even more funding for teacher training, and then provides direct funds to PELSB, which is, for anyone who's not aware, that's our education and licensing board. Minnesota's unusual. Most states do not have a separate board. It's just through the Department of Education. But that's one of the things that the working group has indicated that needs to be a top priority, is for PELSB to begin to work on a teacher certification. So how can you all help with this legislation? But before I even talk about that, I want to just like go through the process, because I think not everyone's familiar with what that looks like. And I think the more that you all are familiar with that process, the more you're able to help and support. So at least in Minnesota, and this is different for every state, bills get introduced in about January or February. The earlier they get introduced, the better. Last year, we actually introduced ours in December, because it was the first time we ever had computer science education. It doesn't have to be introduced in the House and the Senate, but it's way better if it is. So both years in Minnesota, we've been able to have a bill introduced in the House and the Senate, and they're generally very similar. So then we have authors and co-authors from both chambers, and one of the things that's exciting about this bill is that it's bipartisan. We've been able to get both Republicans and DFL representatives on this legislation, which is just really great. And it shows that it is an issue that is important for all schools and all kids, regardless of political affiliation. And then once the bill gets introduced, there are hearings in both chambers. There's a lot of hearings. There's generally 3 to 5 hearings in total. And then what usually happens is the education bill gets rolled up into a really big education bill called an omnibus bill, and that gets passed in late spring. And so we go through this process. The hearings are sort of a chance for us, and I say us as anyone who's an advocate, to advocate and say why this small education bill deserves to be in the big education bill. So how do we take this process, this kind of wonky legislative process, and we translate it into all of us who are potentially interested in supporting? So there's a lot of different ways. And I'll share this link as soon as I'm done with the presentation. The first is a really easy one. We have this thing called the Voter Voice Campaign, where we have a letter already written. You guys can edit it if you want, but you're also able just to put your name in and send it directly to your representatives. And it says, I think computer science is really important. I really want you to support the legislation that exists this year. That's the first, and I would say the easiest thing. Second thing is to read and share the state plan to your wider networks. That state plan really lays out the vision for where we want to be in a state in 5 or 10 years. And the more people who know about that plan, who can try and hold the people in power accountable, the better. And then additionally, while we, are wrapping up the legislative session for 2024, we're going to be back next year, and the year after, we're going to continue every year to be in front of the legislature. And we always need advocates. So we always need letters of support. We also, for every hearing, we try and have teachers and students testify. And so I'm going to put my email in the chat, but if anyone is interested in future years getting more intimately involved in that process, you're very welcome. And they do in person, and they also do remote testimony. So we try and make it as easy as possible for folks to engage with the process. So I'm going to pause here for any questions. And then while folks are maybe thinking of that, I'm going to put some of those links in the chat. And I'll also share the whole presentation with you as well. But here's that voter voice link, so easy way to get involved. And then here's that state plan as well. And then just so you can easily copy, this is my email. So in our last few minutes together, questions, thoughts, opinions, feelings, anything I didn't cover that you're wondering? I might not have an answer, but you're welcome to ask. Wonderful. Additionally, I would say LinkedIn is probably the platform in which there's the most conversation about computer science education policy in Minnesota. So certainly feel free to to follow myself and other people on LinkedIn who are posting a lot, but there are ample ways to get involved. And we very much appreciate as much support as possible. So please reach out with any questions, or if you just want an update, if you're just curious in a month, like if the legislation passed or not, feel free to reach out. But would really encourage you all to fill out that voter voice campaign and send it to your networks. It's a really representatives, the more emails they get, the more calls they get about stuff, they tally those up. And so the more that they hear that a piece of legislation is important to constituents, the more likely they are to prioritize it. Jean, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you link? You said that a lot of these like conversations around CSN policy ministers happening on LinkedIn. Is there like a group or something? Could you link that as well?
Yeah, I'll put let's see, I'll put a few. It's not necessarily a group, but there's kind of like a few of us who like publicly. So I'll put a few of the good organizations to follow. So I think the first one is this group I mentioned, the Northern Lights Collaborative. So that's out of Minnesota. That's a really helpful one to follow. And CS for All Minnesota is also a very helpful one to follow. And you'll see sort of us all kind of posting kind of back and forth and sort of trying to amplify as well. And then the one last group is, we've been really lucky in Minnesota. We have an organization called MNTech. So that's the Minnesota Technology Association, and they're the association for like all the big tech companies in Minnesota. And they've been really big partners. And so they certainly post a lot as well. Any other questions or anything else that I missed that folks are wondering? Oh, wonderful. I know we're a little bit early, but I'll give you guys a little bit of time back. But thank you so much for joining this breakout room. And I'll also actually, the last thing is I'll put in the chat the slideshow. This is all public information, so you're very welcome to use it, to pull slides, whatever might be helpful. And then you very much have my email to always email me with questions. So thank you all so much. This is really great.